Understanding ancient Greece requires setting aside the expectation of a clear beginning marked by formal declaration or decisive moment of origin. What exists instead is a foundation built upon collective memory, something inherently unstable and continuously reshaped through the act of transmission itself, existing in a space that resists categorization as either pure fiction or verifiable fact. Writing did not serve as the vessel for Greek historical consciousness during its earliest centuries. Instead, the vehicle was oral tradition, expressed through ceremonial practice, through verse, and through narratives that functioned simultaneously as explanations of origin and as frameworks for interpreting the natural and social order. Within the Greek conceptual framework, mythology was not understood as an alternative to factual experience, but rather as the medium through which factual experience achieved its fullest expression. The cosmos was perceived not as operating according to impersonal principles, but as responding to intentional beings with desires and temperaments. When thunder sounded across the sky, this was not explained through mechanical processes involving air and moisture, but understood as Zeus making his will manifest. The ocean was not conceived as an inert body of water, but as territory subject to the volatile moods of Poseidon. Even the concept of destiny was personified through the Moirai, three figures who controlled the length and quality of every mortal existence by spinning thread, measuring its extent and severing it at the appointed moment. Existence for those living in this culture meant inhabiting a universe that felt intimately connected to conscious purpose, even as that purpose remained fundamentally beyond human comprehension. The Greek narrative of cosmic origins reveals this perspective with striking precision. The initial state is not one of order or peace, but rather chaos, an undifferentiated condition without form or organizing principle. Out of this void come the earliest divine entities, followed by the race of titans, and ultimately the generation of gods who would reside on Olympus. Each successive group of divine powers displaces the one before it through acts of aggression and strategic intelligence. Continuity of rule is never assured. Authority must be claimed through force, maintained through vigilance, and legitimized through ongoing demonstration of capability. Zeus attains his position as supreme deity not through inheritance or cosmic predetermination, but through his capacity to overcome and imprison his own father. This recurring theme of contested succession would continue to resonate within Greek thinking about governance and political legitimacy across subsequent centuries. Human beings, as they appear within this mythological structure, exist in a state of fundamental vulnerability. They possess less power than the divine, yet they also demonstrate the capacity for reasoning, for aspiration, and for acts of resistance. Divine protection is neither guaranteed nor withdrawn entirely. Greek mythology consistently emphasizes the danger of hubris, the fatal error of believing oneself capable of exceeding the boundaries inherent to human nature. Prometheus suffers eternal punishment for providing humanity with the gift of fire. Arachne is transformed and diminished after presuming to rival Athena in skill. These narratives communicated a principle that was straightforward yet unforgiving. Cleverness and drive have value, but only when accompanied by recognition of one's limitations. Even as mythology provided the Greeks with their sense of shared identity, archaeological investigation has uncovered the physical remnants of their civilization's development. Throughout the earlier portion of the Bronze Age, the region surrounding the Aegean Sea was shaped predominantly by Minoan culture, centered on the island of Crete. This society presents characteristics that diverge notably from those of later Greek communities. Minoan visual art emphasizes organic forms, ceremonial activities, and images suggesting fluidity rather than military domination. The architectural complexes they constructed were not surrounded by the substantial defensive structures that would later define cities on the mainland. Centralized authority likely existed, but its expression appears to have been channeled through religious ceremony and through systems of economic management rather than through perpetual armed conflict. The reasons for Minoan decline remain incompletely understood, but the culture that subsequently gained prominence on the mainland represents a clear departure. The Mycenaean civilization emerged as a society organized around a warrior elite. The settlements they established, including Mycenae itself along with Tiryns and Pylos, were encircled by walls constructed from enormous stones, architecture that communicated a worldview shaped by insecurity and rivalry. Mycenaean rulers exercised power through hierarchical structures, through the redistribution of goods and labor, and through the threat or application of violence. Their administrative operations were preserved on tablets of baked clay inscribed with Linear B, an early written form of the Greek language that served to track taxation, land allocation, religious contributions, and military arrangements. This civilization was intensely preoccupied with maintaining control over resources and populations. Material goods were accounted for with precision. Human labor was directed according to centralized planning. Commands originated from the palace and moved outward through layers of subordinates. Despite this elaborate organization, the system proved unable to sustain itself indefinitely. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the Mycenaean political structure disintegrated as part of a broader collapse, affecting much of the eastern Mediterranean basin. The causes were interconnected and numerous, involving environmental deterioration, internal social fractures, external military pressure, and the structural weaknesses inherent in overextended administrative systems. What matters most is not the precise mechanism of collapse, but its consequences. The palace centers were destroyed by fire. The apparatus of centralized governance ceased to function. The use of writing was abandoned. Greece entered an extended interval characterized by fragmentation and gradual recovery. The period often referred to as the Greek Dark Age should not be understood as an era of complete stagnation, but rather as one of fundamental reorganization. In the absence of monarchical authority and palace bureaucracies, communities restructured themselves around bonds of family, around leaders whose influence was local rather than territorial, and around the imperative of collective survival. Long-distance exchange diminished in scale but continued to occur. Traditions of craftsmanship persisted through adaptation. Most significantly, cultural continuity was maintained not through written documentation but through remembered narratives. Storytelling became the principal mechanism for transmitting a sense of collective past, for preserving ethical values, and for maintaining historical consciousness. It was within this context that the Homeric epics reached the form in which they would eventually be known. The Iliad and the Odyssey were not committed to writing until a later period, but they were composed through oral performance and refined across multiple generations. These works do not function as straightforward chronicles of Mycenaean reality, but rather as interpretations and meditations upon it. They present characters who inhabit a world governed by honor and organized around violence, yet who simultaneously grapple with profound questions concerning death, obligation, fury, and grief. The rage of Achilles becomes a force that endangers the very objective for which he fights. Odysseus achieves survival not through physical dominance but through flexibility of mind, through strategic misdirection, and through the ability to withstand hardship. These were not arbitrary emphases. They reflected the preoccupations of communities engaged in the process of rebuilding social order following systemic collapse. Approaching the 8th century before the Common Era, conditions in Greece began to exhibit greater stability. Demographic expansion resumed its upward trajectory. Networks facilitating trade became more extensive and reliable. Interaction with cultures of the Near East increased in frequency and intensity. Through contact with Phoenician traders, the Greeks acquired knowledge of alphabetic writing, which they modified to accommodate the phonetic requirements of their own language. The significance of this development extends beyond mere convenience. Written language fundamentally altered the nature of legal systems, transformed religious practice, and reconfigured the possibilities for political organization. It enabled agreements and obligations to persist beyond the lifespan of individual memory, and created opportunities for traditional authority to be examined and contested through permanent record. During this same period, the most characteristic form of Greek political organization came into existence. The polis represented something more than simply an urban center. It was a community constituted by shared legal codes, by common religious observances, and by a collective sense of belonging and identity. Unlike the sprawling imperial structures found elsewhere, individual Greek polis remained small in scale, adamantly autonomous, and engaged in continuous competition with one another. Allegiance was directed toward the local community rather than toward any broader political entity. Identity was defined through civic participation. Membership in a polis conferred a form of agency that, while circumscribed by class and gender, represented something distinct from subject status within a monarchy. The various polis developed divergent approaches to governance. Some communities maintained rule by aristocratic families, others preserved monarchical institutions, and still others experimented with forms of collective decision-making. No single template for political organization achieved dominance across the Greek world. Instead, the region functioned as an environment in which different constitutional arrangements could be tested and compared. This variety stimulated innovation in political thought and practice, but it simultaneously guaranteed ongoing antagonism between neighboring communities. Armed conflict was not an aberration within Greek society, but rather a persistent structural feature. Religious practice adapted to accommodate this political fragmentation. While the major Olympian deities were recognized throughout regions inhabited by Greek speakers, individual cities emphasized particular gods as their special protectors. Sacred sites such as Delphi, Olympia, and Delos operated as venues where Greeks from competing polis could gather, seek prophetic guidance, and engage in formalized competition through athletic contests. These institutions served to reinforce a sense of common cultural heritage without requiring the dissolution of political boundaries or the surrender of local autonomy. By the conclusion of this formative period, Greece had not yet generated democratic institutions, systematic philosophy, or imperial ambitions. What it had generated were the preconditions that would eventually make all three developments possible. This was a civilization characterized by persistent tensions rather than resolution, by the interplay between mythological inheritance and emerging rationality, between individual autonomy and communal obligation, between the desire for stability and the acceptance of change. The Greeks did not pursue harmony as a primary objective. Instead, they pursued comprehension through the experience of conflict and contradiction. The Greek world did not emerge as a monolithic cultural entity, but rather as an ongoing exchange of ideas and practices, sometimes characterized by cooperation, frequently marked by violence, and perpetually incomplete in its development. This exchange, this conversation, conducted across generations and between rival communities, was entering its earliest phases during the period under consideration. With centuries of transformation still lying ahead, the development of the Greek polis cannot be understood as a deliberate creation, nor did it emerge from any comprehensive theoretical blueprint. Rather, it represented an unplanned response to an ongoing challenge. The question of how smaller settlements could sustain themselves, establish internal governance, and preserve social cohesion in an environment devoid of monarchical authority, imperial structures, or supernatural assurances of continuity. The disintegration of the Mycenaean palace-centered system had eliminated hierarchical governance, yet this collapse had not eliminated human drives toward power accumulation, toward protective vigilance, or toward mutual rivalry. As demographic recovery gradually occurred and communities grew in size, the necessity for alternative organizational frameworks became impossible to avoid. The earliest Greek settlements maintained cohesion through familial connections and inherited custom rather than through codified institutional arrangements. Authority emerged informally, typically concentrated among aristocratic lineages who asserted genealogical links to legendary figures from the past. These privileged groups exercised control over agricultural land, over ceremonial practices, and over the distribution of military equipment. For a period, this arrangement functioned adequately. However, as commercial networks expanded and as sources of wealth became more varied, the existing equilibrium began to fracture. Individuals acquired economic resources without possessing hereditary prestige. Agriculturalists of modest means fell into cycles of indebtedness. Social friction intensified, and the prospect of internal violence became increasingly frequent. The polis developed as a structural solution designed to manage this instability. It codified principles of inclusion and of exclusion. It established clear definitions regarding who possessed civic status and who remained outside that category. It instituted legal frameworks understood not as the personal directives of rulers, but as collective arrangements binding the entire community. This transformation carried revolutionary implications. Legitimate authority no longer derived exclusively from genealogical claims or from supernatural endorsement, but rather from engagement within a shared civic framework. Yet this engagement remained constrained, hierarchical in practice, and subject to continuous contestation. The developmental trajectory differed from one polis to another. Geographic circumstances, historical experiences, and the composition of local populations shaped the political evolution of each individual city. Among the entirety of Greek city-states, two emerged as polar extremes, embodying fundamentally opposed responses to identical questions of governance and social organization. These contrasting communities were Sparta and Athens. The formation of Sparta's distinctive system was fundamentally shaped by collective anxiety. Situated within the agriculturally productive valley formed by the Eurotas River, Sparta achieved military conquest over the neighboring territory of Messenia during its early developmental period. This conquest provided economic advantages and ensured reliable agricultural output, yet it simultaneously generated a permanent threat originating from within the conquered population itself. The Messenian people were reduced to helot status, a condition of state-controlled servitude requiring them to cultivate land for the benefit of their Spartan overlords. These subject populations vastly outnumbered their masters. The entirety of Spartan institutional structure was constructed around the imperative of controlling this demographic majority and preventing organized resistance. This persistent state of anxiety produced a society characterized by intense emphasis on regimentation, on conformity, and on continuous military preparedness. Unlike other communities throughout the Greek world, Sparta actively discouraged commercial activity, restricted travel beyond its borders, and resisted cultural innovation. Its political structure was deliberately archaic in design, combining elements of monarchy, oligarchic governance, and collective supervision. Two monarchs ruled concurrently, an arrangement designed to prevent excessive concentration of power in any single individual. A council composed of elder citizens preserved traditional practices. An assembly existed within the constitutional framework, though its actual authority remained severely limited. The preservation of stability took precedence over encouragement of innovation. Spartan educational practices reflected these underlying priorities with remarkable clarity. The agoge system involved removing male children from their family households at an early age, and subjecting them to a severe training regimen explicitly designed to eliminate expressions of weakness and to suppress individuality. Deprivation of adequate nutrition, exposure to physical discomfort, and emphasis on unquestioning obedience functioned as pedagogical instruments. Literacy received minimal attention. Emotional display was actively discouraged. The idealized Spartan citizen was not characterized by creativity or by intellectual curiosity, but rather by capacity to endure hardship, by unwavering loyalty to the state, and by habitual restraint in speech. Even Spartan women, frequently cited as possessing unusual freedoms relative to women elsewhere in the Greek world, existed within this overarching logic of state service. They engaged in physical training, possessed rights to property ownership, and spoke with a directness uncommon among Greek women generally. Yet their social value was ultimately measured by their capacity to produce physically robust male offspring. Spartan society did not restrict women's activities in order to subsequently empower them as individuals. Rather, it granted them certain privileges, specifically to enable them to serve state objectives more effectively. Athens followed an evolutionary path that diverged significantly from Sparta's trajectory. Its territory offered less agricultural fertility, its population exhibited greater diversity in occupation and origin, and its economic system became progressively more dependent upon maritime commerce and upon artisanal production. These conditions rendered strict social rigidity impractical as a governing principle. Athens could not achieve long-term survival by attempting to freeze its social structure in place. Adaptation to changing circumstances became essential. Yet this adaptive process involved considerable internal conflict and suffering. Early Athenian society remained dominated by aristocratic clans who exercised control over both land ownership and legal interpretation. Farmers who accumulated debts frequently forfeited their personal freedom, entering into slavery to fellow citizens who held power over them. The intensifying tension between economic classes threatened to precipitate civil war. The prospect of violence originated not from external adversaries, but from contradictions within the community itself. The reforms implemented by Solon represent Athens' initial systematic attempt to resolve this crisis without causing the complete dissolution of the polis as a functioning entity. Solon did not establish democracy through his legislative actions. Instead, he created temporary relief from immediate pressures by canceling accumulated debts, by abolishing the practice of debt-based enslavement, and by reorganizing political participation according to wealth categories rather than aristocratic birth. He weakened the monopoly held by traditional elites while simultaneously preserving hierarchical social stratification. His legal reforms aimed not at justice as modern societies might conceive it, but rather at achieving sustainable stability. The achievement of stability, however, did not eliminate individual ambition or political maneuvering. The emergence of tyrannical rule under Pisistratus demonstrated both the fragility and the flexibility inherent in Athenian social structures. Though exercising authority through coercive means, Pisistratus governed with pragmatic calculation. He provided financial support for public festivals, encouraged artistic production, and enhanced Athens' position within regional commercial networks. Tyranny, understood within this specific context, did not represent pure oppression or absolute despotism. Rather, it functioned as a transitional phase during which authority became centralized while simultaneously establishing cultural and economic foundations for future development. The eventual collapse of tyrannical rule reopened fundamental questions that Solon's reforms had only temporarily addressed. Who possessed legitimate authority to govern? How much power could be safely entrusted to the general citizenry? The reforms attributed to Cleisthenes responded to these questions in ways unprecedented within Greek political experience. By restructuring political identity around geographic units, Rather than around traditional kinship networks, he systematically dismantled the power bases of aristocratic families. Authority was redistributed through council membership, through assembly participation, and through selection by lottery. Democratic governance emerged not from abstract idealism, but from concrete political struggle and calculated institutional engineering. Athenian democracy was simultaneously radical in its innovations and profoundly flawed in its exclusions. Participation remained restricted to male citizens whose status derived from specific ancestry. Women, enslaved persons, and foreign residents were categorically excluded from political processes. Decisions were reached through large assemblies that remained vulnerable to emotional manipulation, to persuasive rhetoric, and to deliberate deception. Nevertheless, for those individuals granted inclusion within the system, democracy fundamentally transformed the nature of daily existence. Political activity was no longer a distant abstraction. It became immediate, conducted publicly, and impossible to avoid for engaged citizens. The agora evolved into the central location of Athenian existence, functioning simultaneously as marketplace, intellectual forum, and political arena. It served as a site where material goods, abstract ideas, and political power all circulated and intersected. Citizens engaged in debate over proposed legislation, brought accusations against rivals, and influenced public policy through the exercise of spoken argumentation. Rhetorical skill became essential for survival within this environment. The capacity for persuasion frequently mattered more than objective accuracy. This generated a culture characterized by perpetual argument and debate, a culture that stimulated intellectual innovation while simultaneously inviting chronic instability. As both Sparta and Athens reached political maturity, they increasingly defined their respective identities through contrast with each other. Sparta perceived Athens as disorderly, lacking in discipline, and dangerously prone to innovation without regard for tradition. Athens perceived Sparta as inflexible, characterized by brutality, and fundamentally barren in intellectual and cultural achievement. Each city came to believe that the other represented a threat that extended beyond military capability to encompass philosophical principles themselves. Despite this developing rivalry, the Greek world maintained interconnections through multiple channels. Religious festivals, athletic competitions, and shared mythological narratives reinforced a sense of cultural commonality that coexisted uneasily alongside political fragmentation. Greeks recognized one another as Hellenes, understanding this identity as distinct from outsiders, whom they categorized collectively as barbarians. This sense of shared identity would soon face external testing. Approaching the final years of the 6th century before the Common Era, Greece existed at a critical juncture in its historical development. Its various cities had produced distinct political systems, divergent social values, and competing visions regarding proper forms of human organization. None of these systems exhibited true stability. None appeared historically inevitable upon close examination. Yet all had become deeply entrenched within their respective communities. Internal tensions accumulated beneath the surface of civic life, and external powers were beginning to direct their attention toward the Greek world with increasing interest. Beyond the waters of the Aegean, a vast empire observed these developments with patient calculation. Persia had not yet initiated military action against Greek territories, but the approach of conflict had already become inevitable. By the closing decades of the 6th century before the Common Era, the Greek polis had evolved beyond its status as an abstract political concept. It had become a lived reality that determined every dimension of daily existence for those living within its boundaries. To possess Greek identity was not primarily a matter of ethnic classification. Rather, it represented a civic designation. An individual did not initially define himself through the general category of being Greek. Instead, self-identification occurred through specific polis membership, whether as Athenian, Spartan, Corinthian, or Theban. Loyalty directed toward the polis took precedence over any allegiance to broader cultural categories, and this loyalty received daily reinforcement through legal obligations, through ritual observances, and through shared exposure to collective risk. Throughout most city-states, citizenship remained a restricted status carrying significant value. To possess citizen status meant holding the right to own land within the community, to participate in assemblies where decisions were made, to serve in military formations, and to defend personal interests through judicial processes. Citizenship also entailed corresponding obligations. Citizens faced expectations to engage in military service, to contribute financially when the state required resources, and to prioritize the survival of the polis above considerations of personal comfort or convenience. Freedom was never understood as a passive condition. It demanded continuous active participation. For those excluded from citizenship, existence followed different organizing principles. Women, enslaved persons, and foreign residents constituted the numerical majority within most polis, yet they possessed no recognized political voice. Women managed household operations, maintained family religious practices, and bore children who would continue family lines, but remained legally dependent upon male guardians throughout their lives. Enslaved persons performed the labor that enabled citizens to enjoy the leisure necessary for political participation. Foreigners, designated as metics, contributed to economic activity, while remaining permanently excluded from the political community. The polis depended fundamentally upon their presence and their labor, yet never extended trust or full incorporation to these groups. This contradiction existed at the structural center of Greek political life. The ideals concerning freedom, concerning equality among citizens, and concerning meaningful participation possessed genuine substance, yet these ideals operated within deliberately narrow boundaries. Democracy did not signify universal inclusion. Rather, it designated intensive participation by a restricted group whose freedom and political agency rested upon the systematic exclusion of others. This tension never achieved complete resolution, and it influenced Greek intellectual development as profoundly as any philosophical doctrine. Sparta represented the most extreme manifestation of collective control over individual existence. Daily life within that society was deliberately stripped of individualistic expression. Meals were consumed communally rather than within family units. Accumulation of wealth was actively discouraged. Artistic expression remained limited in scope and form. Conversation was expected to be brief and directed toward practical purposes. Even leisure time was subject to regulation. Spartan citizens were not encouraged to conceive of themselves as private individuals possessing personal ambitions, but rather as components within a larger military organism functioning according to collective imperatives. Fear provided the sustaining foundation for this entire system. The Helot population represented a constant threat to stability, and Spartans never permitted themselves to forget this reality. Annual ritual declarations of war against the Helots formalized violence and provided justification for ongoing repression. Young Spartan males were periodically dispatched on covert missions designed to intimidate and eliminate potential rebel leaders, not because such actions possessed immediate strategic necessity, but because terror functioned as an instrument of governance. The polis achieved its survival by rendering fear a permanent condition of existence. Athens, in contrast, maintained its existence within a state of managed instability. Its citizens engaged in continuous argumentation. Laws underwent debate, revision, overturning, and challenge within public judicial settings. Political life remained unpredictable, frequently chaotic in appearance, and emotionally charged in practice. Yet this instability generated productive energy. New ideas emerged, not despite conflict, but precisely because conflict was permitted and even encouraged. The Athenian citizen faced expectations to speak publicly, to persuade others, and to exercise judgment. Silence was not regarded as a virtue. Engagement was the defining characteristic of citizenship. The legal system illustrates this fundamental difference with particular clarity. Within Sparta, law was understood as tradition. It underwent change rarely and with great reluctance. Within Athens, law was understood as performance. Litigants represented themselves without professional advocates, making appeals to juries consisting of hundreds of fellow citizens. Success in legal proceedings depended less upon objective truth than upon persuasive narrative construction. This system rewarded rhetorical competence and emotional intelligence, thereby reinforcing a culture in which words functioned as weapons in ongoing struggles for advantage. Military service further revealed contrasting value systems between these cities. Spartan soldiers underwent training throughout their entire lives, specifically for warfare. Combat represented both their profession and their identity. Athenian soldiers were citizen farmers, artisans, and merchants who fought when military necessity required and returned to civilian occupations when military campaigns concluded. This difference in military organization produced different attitudes toward warfare itself. Sparta pursued decisive land battles that preserved existing order and minimized disruption. Athens, becoming increasingly dependent upon naval power, embraced mobility as a strategic principle, valued flexibility in tactical approaches, and pursued long-term strategic calculations. Religion functioned as a stabilizing force within both systems, though operating through different mechanisms. Spartan religious practice emphasized obedience to tradition and reinforcement of continuity. Rituals served to reinforce existing social hierarchies. Athenian religious practice exhibited greater dynamism. Festivals such as the Dionysia encouraged artistic experimentation, facilitated public reflection, and even permitted criticism of authority through dramatic performance. Tragedy emerged not as mere entertainment, but as civic examination conducted publicly. Theatrical performances posed questions concerning justice, concerning power, and concerning responsibility before audiences of citizens who would subsequently vote on actual political decisions affecting the community. As various poleis interacted through commercial exchange, through colonial expansion, and through warfare, competitive pressures intensified. Colonial settlements dispersed Greek cultural practices across the Mediterranean basin, exporting political concepts while adapting them to new environmental contexts. These settlements relieved demographic pressure within mother cities, but simultaneously extended rivalries into new geographic territories. Conflict became a defining characteristic of Greek international relations, normalized and ritualized through alliance structures and treaty arrangements that rarely achieved lasting permanence. This perpetual competition sharpened Greek collective self-awareness. Greeks compared different political systems, subjected one another to mockery and criticism, and learned through contrasting observations. Philosophical inquiry emerged not in isolation from practical concerns, but rather from political life itself. Questions concerning justice, concerning virtue, and concerning proper human organization were not purely academic exercises. They represented practical concerns debated within assemblies, within judicial proceedings, and within symposia where citizens gathered for discussion. By the conclusion of this developmental period, the Greek world had achieved something without historical precedent. It had created multiple functioning political systems operating within a shared cultural framework, each offering different responses to fundamental human problems concerning governance and social organization. None exhibited complete stability, none achieved comprehensive solutions. Yet all remained vital and generative of new possibilities. This vitality, however, carried inherent costs. Internal division weakened capacity for collective defense. Rivalry generated mutual suspicion. When an external power finally initiated action against Greece, it would encounter not a unified civilization but rather a fragmented one, characterized by brilliance and defiance, yet dangerously unprepared for coordinated resistance. The polis had fundamentally shaped Greek consciousness and patterns of thought. Historical events were now positioned to test the viability of these structures. Approaching the end of the 6th century before the Common Era, the Greek world had arrived at a critical stage within its developmental trajectory. The polis system had matured sufficiently to generate stable political identities rooted in local communities, yet it remained excessively fragmented to function as a unified force capable of coordinated action. Each individual city-state understood itself as complete in its sovereignty and self-sufficient in its organization, yet none possessed the territorial scale, the resource base, or the capacity for coordination necessary to confront a genuinely imperial power. This fundamental contradiction between strong local identity paired with systemic disunity defined the Greek condition on the eve of confrontation with Persia. To the east, the Persian Empire represented a fundamentally different conception of political order. It was not constructed around the active participation of citizens in governance, nor did it depend upon constant debate or upon internal competition as organizing principles. Persian authority descended from the great king through an elaborate administrative network designed to manage diversity within the empire rather than to eliminate it through forced assimilation. Conquered populations were not required to abandon their traditional customs or to cease worship of their ancestral deities. They were required to maintain obedience, to remit tribute to imperial authorities, and to refrain from organized rebellion. This model generated stability across a territorial scale that Greeks could scarcely comprehend. From the Persian perspective, the Greek cities did not represent equals or legitimate rivals. They appeared as marginal communities occupying the peripheral edge of the known world, possessing potential strategic importance, yet lacking cultural significance from an imperial standpoint. Their perpetual warfare and internal disputes appeared inefficient, even childish in their pettiness. Yet it was precisely this culture of argumentation and resistance that rendered Greece unpredictable as a political entity. Persia possessed the capacity to defeat armies through superior organization and resources. It struggled to comprehend defiance rooted not in hierarchical authority but in collective identity and civic pride. The Ionian Greek cities embodied this fundamental tension with particular clarity. Located along the western coastal regions of Anatolia, these cities had flourished as centers of commercial activity, of philosophical inquiry, and of institutional experimentation. Their geographic proximity to the Persian heartland rendered them economically valuable, yet simultaneously vulnerable to imperial control. Under Persian rule, they maintained economic prosperity, yet forfeited political autonomy. Tyrants appointed by imperial authority replaced civic councils as governing bodies. Over time, this erosion of self-governance became intolerable to communities whose identity had become increasingly tied to participation in decision-making and to public debate. The Ionian Revolt did not emerge from a unified ideological vision or from coordinated strategic planning. It was fragmented in execution, inconsistent in its objectives, and strategically weak in its organization. Yet it expressed something powerful and consequential: the refusal of Greek cities to accept permanent subordination to external authority. Aristagoras of Miletus, whose personal ambitions helped trigger the revolt, understood that appeals to freedom resonated deeply within Greek cultural consciousness. Even when the revolt faltered militarily, it succeeded symbolically. It forced Greece and Persia into direct confrontation that could no longer be avoided. Athens' decision to involve itself in the revolt marked a transformative moment in its historical trajectory. By dispatching naval vessels to aid the Ionian cities, and by participating in the burning of Sardis, Athens transitioned from regional politics into imperial conflict. This action did not receive universal support within the city, yet it revealed an emerging confidence rooted in democratic identity. Athens was beginning to conceive of itself not merely as one polis among many others, but as a defender of a particular way of organizing human society. The failure of the Ionian revolt proved devastating in its consequences. Persian retribution was systematic and deliberately instructive to other potential rebels. Cities were destroyed through military action, populations were forcibly deported from their ancestral territories, and local elites were systematically eliminated. Miletus, previously a beacon of Greek cultural achievement, was reduced to ruins. For mainland Greece, this destruction functioned simultaneously as warning and as prophecy. Resistance without unity led inevitably to annihilation, yet submission threatened the very identity that Greeks valued most fundamentally. Darius I did not immediately launch a comprehensive invasion of Greece proper. His approach reflected imperial logic and calculated strategy. He tested Greek resolve, probed for weaknesses, and measured responses. Envoys were dispatched demanding earth and water as symbolic tokens of submission to Persian authority. Some Greek cities complied, calculating that survival took precedence over pride. Others refused, understanding that refusal meant inevitable war. This moment exposed profound fractures within the Greek world. Cultural unity did not guarantee political solidarity or coordinated action. The first Persian expedition directed against Greece was limited in scope, intended primarily to punish Athens and Eretria, rather than to achieve conquest of the entire region. When Persian forces landed at Marathon, they encountered an enemy unlike any they had previously faced. The Athenian army was not professional in the Persian sense of that term. It consisted of citizens fighting not for monetary compensation or in response to hierarchical command, but for the survival of their political community and their way of life. The Battle of Marathon altered Greek collective self-perception in fundamental ways. The defeat of Persian forces by a citizen army shattered the myth of imperial invincibility. Yet this victory carried a dangerous implication for future Greek thinking. It suggested that courage and unity could overcome overwhelming numerical and organizational superiority. The Greeks did not yet understand that Marathon represented an exceptional circumstance rather than a guarantee of future success. Persia learned lessons from its defeat. The empire did not collapse or retreat permanently from its ambitions. It recalibrated its strategy and preparations. Under Xerxes, preparations for invasion reached unprecedented scale. This was not merely a military operation. It represented a demonstration of imperial capacity and organizational sophistication. Bridges were constructed across the Hellespont connecting continents. Supply routes were mapped and secured in advance of troop movements. Armies assembled from across the vast empire, representing dozens of distinct cultures unified under a single command structure. As reports of Xerxes' advance circulated, fear rippled throughout Greece. Some cities chose immediate submission, others hesitated, calculating the costs of resistance. Athens and Sparta, ideological opposites in nearly every respect, were forced into cooperation by necessity. This alliance was fragile, shaped more by mutual fear of Persian domination than by genuine trust or shared values. Yet, it represented the closest Greece had ever approached to collective action on this scale. The defense of Thermopylae revealed both the strengths and the limitations inherent in Greek resistance. The narrow pass neutralized Persian numerical superiority, allowing heavily armed Greek hoplites to hold defensive positions. Leonidas's decision to remain at the pass and die with his forces was not an act of blind heroism detached from strategic calculation. but rather a calculated sacrifice designed to delay Persian advance and buy time for other preparations. His death became embedded in Greek mythology, yet its strategic value lay in the time gained rather than in the ground temporarily held. The fall of Athens marked the psychological low point of the entire war. The city was evacuated, its population dispersed across allied territories, its temples burned and desecrated. For a civilization that tied identity so fundamentally to place, this destruction seemed to represent finality. Yet it forced a profound transformation in Athenian self-understanding. Athens ceased to be primarily a city constructed of stone and became instead a people in motion. Its naval fleet, rather than its defensive walls, became its primary means of defense and survival. The naval engagement at Salamis represented a shift from reliance upon brute force towards strategic intelligence and tactical flexibility. Themistocles exploited Persian overconfidence, drawing their fleet into confined waters where numerical size became a liability rather than an advantage. The chaos of naval battle erased the advantages of imperial coordination, exposing the limitations of centralized command when faced with unpredictable circumstances. Persian defeat at sea did not end the war immediately, yet it altered its trajectory in ways that proved irreversible. The final confrontation at Plataea confirmed what the battle at Salamis had revealed. Persian forces, operating far from their home territories and stretched thin across extensive supply lines, could be defeated through coordinated Greek action. The victory did not destroy Persian power in any absolute sense, yet it ended the immediate threat to Greek autonomy. Greece had survived not because it possessed superior strength, but because it adapted more rapidly to changing circumstances. The aftermath of the Persian Wars fundamentally reshaped the Greek world. Victory generated confidence, stimulated ambition, and intensified rivalry. Athens emerged as a naval power, becoming increasingly assertive in its leadership of allied states. Sparta remained cautious, wary of change, and suspicious of expansion. The fragile unity forged under the pressure of Persian invasion began to dissolve almost immediately once that external threat receded. Yet, something irreversible had occurred through this shared experience. The Greeks had confronted an empire and survived the encounter. This experience deepened their sense of cultural distinctiveness and reinforced collective belief that their political systems, however flawed in practice, were worth defending. Freedom, previously a primarily local concern, became transformed into a shared ideal, even as its meaning remained contested among different Greek communities. The Persian Wars did not resolve Greek contradictions or eliminate internal tensions. Rather, they intensified existing divisions. Power relationships shifted, identities hardened, and the question of leadership replaced the question of survival as the central political problem. Greece stood victorious yet uneasy, poised between possibilities for cooperation and renewed internal conflict. The external threat had passed beyond the immediate horizon. The internal struggle was positioned to begin. When the Persian ships disappeared beyond the distant horizon and the smoke from burned temples slowly drifted away from the Attic sky, Athens stood in profound silence, surrounded by ruins that still carried the smell of ash and salt. The city had survived, yet survival alone was not what defined this moment. What mattered was what the Athenians chose to do next. They could rebuild what had been lost and return to what they had been, or they could create something entirely new. Athens chose transformation over restoration. The wooden houses and shattered sanctuaries were not restored immediately. Instead, the city turned first toward the sea. Under the strategic guidance of Themistocles, Athens embraced naval power not merely as a military necessity, but as the foundation for its future strength and influence. Construction began on long walls, stretching from the urban center to the harbor of Piraeus, binding land and sea together into a single integrated defensive organism. These walls represented more than mere fortification. They constituted a declaration of principle. Athens would never again face isolation, would never again be trapped behind defensive perimeters, would never again find itself helpless before superior forces. While Sparta continued measuring strength through hoplite formations and through military discipline, Athens had discovered a different source of power: mobility itself. Ships could reach distant destinations. Commercial exchange could flow continuously. Influence could spread without requiring territorial borders. With this realization, the balance of power within the Greek world began to shift in ways that could not be reversed. The Delian League came into existence under the official justification of providing protection. Its stated purpose was to guard Greece from any potential return of Persian forces, to ensure that the terror of invasion would never repeat itself. Each allied city contributed either ships or silver, trusting Athens to provide leadership because Athens had proven its capacity at Salamis. Initially, the alliance felt voluntary in nature, even hopeful in its prospects. However, power rarely remains neutral over extended periods. As years passed, contributions transformed into obligations, and obligations hardened into commands that could not be refused. The treasury was relocated from Delos to Athens, justified officially as a matter of security, yet understood by all parties as a shift in control. Without making explicit announcement, without issuing formal declarations, Athens had constructed an empire. Into this transformed world stepped Pericles, an individual whose influence would come to define not merely a city, but an entire era. Pericles did not seize power through force or manipulation. He was chosen repeatedly through democratic processes by citizens who trusted his vision and valued his restraint. He spoke slowly and deliberately, without theatrical excess in his presentations, yet his words carried weight because they offered something Athens desperately wanted: a sense of meaning and purpose. Pericles believed that Athens was not merely strong in military terms, but exceptional in its character, not through birth or through divine favor, but through conscious choice and collective effort. Under his leadership, democratic participation expanded its reach within Athenian society. Citizens received payment for their service in public roles, allowing even those of modest means to participate in political life. Courts grew in power and authority, juries expanded in size, debates continued constantly. Decisions were made not behind palace walls or in secret councils, but in open assemblies under the sun where citizens could witness and participate. The city argued with itself endlessly, loudly, passionately, convinced that through discussion and debate, truth could emerge from conflict. Yet this democracy rested upon fundamental contradictions. Enslaved persons worked the fields and managed the households that allowed citizens the leisure necessary for political participation. Women remained excluded from political life, their roles confined to the private sphere of household management and family preservation. Foreigners could reside and conduct commerce in Athens, yet never achieve full membership in the political community. The Athenians spoke of equality while carefully defining who qualified as equal under law and custom. Still, for the ancient world, this system was remarkable. Never before had so many ordinary individuals been asked to shape the fate of their own city through direct participation. Pericles understood that power without aesthetic expression fades from memory, and that beauty without meaning becomes mere decoration without lasting significance. Therefore, he transformed Athens into a city of stone and of thought. The Acropolis rose again, not as a fortress designed for defense, but as a vision carved in marble meant to inspire. The Parthenon did not overwhelm through size alone, it persuaded through harmony of proportion. Every line bent slightly to correct optical distortion, every proportion calculated to suggest perfection without rigidity. It was not built merely to honor Athena in her divine capacity, but to teach citizens what balance and harmony looked like in physical form. As sunlight struck the marble surfaces, the city gleamed visibly. Allied cities saw this and understood who ruled the Aegean. Citizens saw it and believed they were part of something that would endure beyond their individual lifetimes. However, the stones were paid for with imperial silver extracted from Allied contributions, and resentment traveled as quietly as merchant vessels across the sea. Below the temples, life pulsed through the agora with constant energy. Philosophers argued, merchants shouted, craftsmen worked, politicians persuaded, and somewhere among them walked a strange figure with bare feet and an unremarkable face. Socrates asked questions that unsettled everyone who heard them. He did not teach predetermined answers. He dismantled certainty and challenged assumptions. He spoke of virtue, of justice, and of wisdom as things that could not be possessed like property, only pursued through continuous inquiry. Many laughed at him. Some admired his methods. A few began to fear what his questions might ultimately reveal. At the same time, the theaters filled with audiences. Tragedies unfolded, stories where heroes fell not because they were evil in nature, but because they were human and flawed. Audiences wept as kings collapsed under the weight of their own pride and ambition. Comedies mocked generals and gods alike, reminding Athenians that no authority was immune to laughter and criticism. The city examined itself constantly, publicly, without mercy or restraint. This was the true miracle of Athens. It questioned itself even at its height of power and confidence. Yet success carries dangerous implications. As Athens grew wealthier and more confident, it grew less patient with dissent or resistance. Revolts within the empire were crushed decisively, sometimes with brutal severity. Neutral cities faced pressure to enter into alliance. Sparta watched with growing unease, sensing that the balance of Greece was slipping beyond repair. What Athens characterized as leadership, others increasingly characterized as domination. Still, within the city itself, the belief persisted that Athens deserved its role of leadership, that its culture justified its exercise of power, that its democracy made its empire different from other empires, better in character, necessary for Greek survival. This belief was fragile and rested upon questionable foundations. History was already moving toward the moment when it would be tested beyond its capacity to endure. Athens stood at the height of its golden age, convinced that it had solved fundamental problems concerning power, concerning freedom, concerning human organization. It believed it had discovered the correct way to live collectively. However, beneath the marble and the speeches, beneath the art and the argument, tension accumulated like heat beneath the earth. The war that would arrive next would not be fought against foreign enemies, but against Greeks themselves. When it arrived, it would expose every illusion Athens had constructed about itself. While the marble of the Acropolis reflected sunlight and foreign envoys stood in awe beneath its columns, the true life of Athens unfolded far below, in narrow streets filled with dust, with voices, with arguments, and with the constant movement of ordinary people trying to survive inside an extraordinary city. The Golden Age was not lived among statues alone. It was lived in homes, in markets, in courts, and in crowded gatherings where ambition, fear, pride, and hope mixed inseparably. To understand Athens at its height, one must step away from Pericles and temples and listen instead to the rhythm of daily life. The Athenian day began early. As the first light touched the rooftops, enslaved persons were already awake, preparing water, bread, and simple meals. Free citizens emerged, slowly discussing rumors, political developments, and decisions from yesterday's assembly. The city never truly slept because thought itself remained always in motion. Politics did not belong to palaces or to elite circles. It belonged to streets, to conversations, to shouted disagreements between individuals who believed deeply that their voices mattered. The agora was the heart of this world. Here, everything met everything else. Philosophers debated virtue beside fish sellers, arguing over prices. Generals walked past potters. Laws were announced publicly. Because law was not meant to be hidden, from those it governed. In Athens, to be a citizen meant to be seen, heard, and judged by one's peers. Yet, citizenship itself was a fragile privilege. To belong, one needed the right parents, the right status, the right gender. Freedom existed, but it was carefully guarded, not generously shared. Women lived within boundaries that the city rarely questioned. Athenian society idealized female silence and invisibility, confining women to the household where their power was private rather than public. They managed homes, supervised enslaved persons, raised children, and preserved family honor. Though excluded from politics, religion offered them a presence. Festivals, rituals, and sacred roles gave women a connection to the divine world that men could never fully control. Enslaved persons, meanwhile, were everywhere in Athenian life. They cooked meals, cleaned streets, worked mines, and taught children. Athens spoke endlessly of freedom while resting upon unfreedom. This contradiction was not ignored. It was accepted. The city justified it through belief, tradition, and perceived necessity, never fully aware that the strength of its democracy was inseparable from this silent labor. Foreigners, known as metics, formed another layer of Athenian life. They traded, crafted, and enriched the city culturally and economically, yet remained permanently outside the political body. Athens welcomed talent but not equality. Religion wove quietly through every aspect of existence. The gods were not distant abstractions. They were neighbors, witnesses, potential threats. Sacrifices marked political decisions. Festivals interrupted war and labor alike. The Panathenaic procession moved through the city like a living myth, reminding Athenians that their identity stretched beyond the present moment into sacred time. But even the gods were questioned here. This was the only city where thinkers dared to ask whether the divine was just, whether fate ruled all, whether human reason might rival tradition. Athens tolerated doubt longer than any ancient society ever had, but tolerance had limits. Justice in Athens was loud, emotional, public. Trials were spectacles. Hundreds of jurors listened to speeches crafted not just to persuade, but to perform. There were no lawyers. A man defended himself with his own voice. Reputation mattered, emotion mattered. Logic mattered, but not alone. The courtroom was a mirror of the democracy itself, collective, imperfect, vulnerable to manipulation, yet undeniably participatory. Education followed a similar path. Boys learned music, poetry, athletics, and rhetoric. Homer was not literature. He was moral instruction. Through epic, Athenians learned courage, restraint, pride, and failure. To speak well was to live well. Words were power. And then there were the symposia, gatherings where wine loosened tongues and ideas flowed freely. Here, men discussed love, politics, beauty, and the nature of existence. Poetry was recited, arguments flared, bonds were formed. These evenings shaped thought as deeply as any public debate, because Athens believed that conversation itself was civilization. Yet beneath this vibrancy lay exhaustion. Empire demanded resources, war demanded readiness. The city asked more and more from its people, even as it promised them greatness. Pride swelled, but anxiety followed close behind. Not every citizen felt equally empowered. Not every voice carried equal weight. And not every doubt could be spoken safely. Athens lived at the edge of brilliance and collapse, without realizing how thin that edge truly was. By the time Pericles stood before the people for the last time, the city had become a paradox, made stone and sound, open yet exclusive, idealistic yet ruthless, reflective yet impatient. It believed itself to be the culmination of human possibility. History, however, was preparing its answer. War did not arrive in Greece suddenly. It did not come with a single declaration or a dramatic first blow. It crept forward, fed by suspicion, resentment, pride, and fear that had been growing quietly for decades. By the time the first armies moved, The war had already been fought many times in the minds of Greeks who no longer trusted one another. Athens and Sparta had defeated Persia together, yet victory had not united them. It had revealed their incompatibility. One was a city of walls and ships, arguments and ambition, convinced that motion and change were signs of strength. The other was a society of discipline and restraint, built on land, silence and obedience, deeply suspicious of novelty and expansion. Each believed the other threatened the natural order of Greece. Thucydides, who would later record this war with cold precision, understood something essential. The real cause of the conflict was not any single incident, but the fear Sparta felt at the growth of Athenian power. Fear, once awakened, does not need proof, it only needs time. When war finally came in 431 before the Common Era, Athens was confident. Pericles still lived. The empire still functioned. The navy remained unmatched. Athens did not fear Spartan armies because Spartan strength lay on land, and Athens believed itself protected by walls and the sea. The strategy was simple and, on paper, brilliant. Avoid direct confrontation, rely on naval power, protect the city behind its walls, and allow time and resources to exhaust the enemy. But war is never fought only on paper. As Spartan armies marched through Attica, burning fields and villages, rural populations fled behind the walls of Athens. The city swelled beyond its limits, streets filled, homes overflowed, sanitation collapsed. And then, quietly at first, death entered the city. The plague struck Athens like an invisible enemy, more ruthless than any army. No strategy could stop it. No wall could keep it out. It moved through crowded neighborhoods, through soldiers, through families, through the heart of the democracy itself. Thucydides, who survived the disease, described bodies piled without ceremony, laws abandoned, customs forgotten, fear dissolved morality, survival replaced honor. Athens, which had believed itself chosen by reason and balance, was reduced to chaos. Pericles watched his city collapse into despair. He gave one final speech, defending his vision, insisting that Athens was still worth the suffering. But the people, exhausted and frightened, turned against him. Not long after, the plague took him too. With Pericles died not just a leader, but restraint. After his death, Athens changed. Without a steady hand, democracy drifted toward impulsiveness. Charismatic speakers replaced thoughtful statesmen. Decisions were made emotionally, not strategically. Successes bred overconfidence. Failures bred cruelty. The war, which had begun as a test of endurance, became a test of character. And Athens began to fail it. Nowhere was this clearer than on the island of Melos. Melos wished to remain neutral. It had done Athens no harm, yet Athens demanded submission, not out of necessity, but example. In the famous dialogue recorded by Thucydides, the Athenians spoke without illusion or shame. They did not appeal to justice. They appealed to power. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. When Melos refused, Athens killed the men and enslaved the women and children. The city that once claimed to be the school of Greece had forgotten its own lessons. As the war dragged on, it consumed everything: wealth, confidence, alliances, and trust. Greek fought Greek. Civil wars erupted within cities as factions aligned themselves with Athens or Sparta. Neighbors turned on one another, traditional values collapsed under pressure, and words themselves changed meaning. Recklessness was called courage. Moderation was called cowardice. Brutality was praised as loyalty. Thucydides did not write this as drama, he wrote it as diagnosis. He believed this was what happens when human nature is exposed by prolonged conflict. Then came the decision that would seal Athens' fate, the Sicilian expedition. Blinded by ambition, persuaded by dreams of limitless expansion, Athens sent a massive force across the sea to Sicily, convinced that one more victory would end the war on its terms. It was a gamble born not of necessity but of arrogance. Even as omens warned against it, even as reason hesitated, the city chose glory over caution. The expedition was a catastrophe. Trapped far from home, cut off from supply, outmaneuvered and outlasted, the Athenian army collapsed. Ships burned, soldiers starved, survivors were enslaved in stone quarries, dying slowly under the sun. When news reached Athens, disbelief turned to silence. The empire had bled itself. What followed was not immediate defeat, but something worse: desperation. Allies revolted, resources vanished. Sparta, aided now by Persian gold, built a fleet of its own. The sea, once Athens' shield, became contested. Internal conflict erupted again, even leading briefly to the overthrow of democracy itself. Athens, exhausted, fractured, and haunted by its own choices, fought on because it no longer knew how to stop. When defeat finally came, in 404 before the Common Era, it was quiet. The walls were torn down, the fleet was surrendered, the empire ended. Sparta imposed rule, but victory brought no triumph. Greece was broken beyond repair. Athens survived but changed forever. Its democracy would return, but without innocence. Its confidence would never fully recover. The Golden Age was over, replaced by memory, regret, and reflection. Greece had proven something tragic and enduring: that brilliance does not protect against self-destruction, and that the greatest enemies of a civilization often rise from within. The war had ended, but its consequences would shape everything that followed. When the last Athenian ships burned in distant harbors and the echo of defeat finally reached the narrow streets of the city, there was no immediate outcry, no dramatic collapse, no single moment of realization. Instead, there was a slow, spreading silence, the kind that settles only after people have exhausted every illusion they once believed in. Athens did not fall in a day. It emptied itself from the inside. Those who had survived returned changed. Veterans no longer spoke easily. Their memories did not arrive as stories, but as fragments. The smell of rot, the sound of oars striking water in darkness, the faces of men left behind. The war had lasted so long that no one remembered what peace felt like. And without memory, peace had no shape. The city itself bore the marks of exhaustion. Assemblies continued, but the debates lacked conviction. Citizens still gathered, still voted, still argued, yet the certainty that once filled these acts was gone. Democracy had survived the war in form, but its spirit was wounded. People had seen how easily fear could manipulate them, how quickly anger could replace judgment, how persuasive voices could turn disaster into applause. Trust, once broken, does not return quickly. Moral language had changed. Words that once carried honor now sounded hollow. Courage no longer meant restraint or duty, but desperation. Justice became revenge disguised as order. Even piety shifted as people questioned whether the gods had abandoned the city or whether the city had abandoned itself. Temples remained, rituals continued, but belief had grown cautious, even transactional. Faith became less about reverence and more about survival. Families suffered quietly. Fathers who had sent sons to war now avoided the agora. Mothers learned not to ask questions whose answers could not be undone. Children grew up surrounded by absence, learning early that loss was ordinary. The war had entered homes not as glory, but as silence. Civil conflict had left scars deeper than any foreign enemy. During the war, Greeks had killed Greeks, not as soldiers alone, but as neighbors. Cities had torn themselves apart from within, factions executing one another in the name of loyalty or justice. Athens was not spared this sickness. The brief rule of the oligarchs, the terror of purges, the betrayals among citizens, these events taught Athenians a lesson more painful than defeat: that democracy could be undone by those who claimed to defend it. The restoration of democracy did not erase these memories. It merely placed them beneath the surface where they would continue to shape fear and caution. The empire was gone, tribute no longer flowed, wealth diminished, art slowed, public works ceased. The city that once defined itself by expansion now turned inward, forced to confront its limits. Athens became a place of reflection rather than ambition. The arrogance that had fueled empire gave way to introspection, regret, and philosophical doubt. This transformation was not entirely destructive. From defeat came thought. It was within this wounded Athens that philosophical inquiry gained new depth and urgency. The questions Socrates had once posed with playful provocation now carried immediate weight and pressing relevance. What constitutes justice when legal systems prove inadequate? What defines virtue when success appears to reward cruelty? What does it mean to be a good citizen after experiencing collective failure? These questions no longer belong to abstract debate conducted for intellectual pleasure. They belong to the necessity of survival and psychological reconstruction. However, Athens was not prepared to confront them with complete honesty. Socrates, who had lived through the entirety of the war and refused to offer flattering reassurances about the city's illusions, became a living reminder of uncomfortable truths that citizens preferred to avoid. He spoke of moral responsibility that could not be evaded, of ignorance that disguised itself as wisdom, of a city that punished honesty when that honesty became too painful to bear. When Athens placed him on trial, it claimed to be defending its fundamental values. In truth, it was defending its psychological wounds from examination. His execution was not solely an act of cruelty, it was an act of fear. The younger generation observed these events and drew their own conclusions. Some turned away from political life entirely, convinced that public engagement corrupted more than it fulfilled. Others began seeking order over freedom, discipline over debate. Across Greece, similar conclusions were being drawn independently. City-states were exhausted. Endless autonomy had produced endless warfare. Independence had brought exhaustion rather than security. The Greek world was prepared for something new, even if it did not yet understand what form that transformation would take. Athens remained culturally vital, yet no longer dominant in political affairs. It taught rather than ruled. Its tragic performances now carried deeper sorrow, its comic productions sharper bitterness. Memory replaced confidence, reflection replaced certainty. The city had become wiser, but at a terrible cost that could never be fully calculated or undone. The Peloponnesian War did not destroy Greece through a single catastrophic blow. It weakened the civilization slowly, eroding the foundations that had once supported brilliance. What followed would not be another golden age, but rather a transition into a world where power belonged not to debate or to beauty, but to discipline, to unity, and to force. The stage was being prepared for Macedonia. When the Peloponnesian War finally concluded, Greece did not enter a condition properly described as peace. It entered something far more difficult to navigate: aftermath. The armies ceased their marching, the ships no longer collided at sea, the cities lowered their weapons. Yet the war did not truly depart. It persisted in habits of thought, in patterns of fear, in established expectations. People had learned to live under pressure, and now they no longer knew how to live without it. The Greeks had once believed that war represented a temporary disruption in an otherwise ordered world. After decades of internal conflict, they understood that war could become a condition of existence itself, shaping character as profoundly as it shaped politics. The struggle had lasted so long that an entire generation had grown to adulthood knowing nothing else. For them, peace was not a return to familiar conditions, but an unknown experiment. Across the Greek world, city-states struggled to recover authority and establish stable governance. Governments changed frequently, not because citizens believed in renewal, but because no system seemed stable enough to endure. Democracy felt fragile and vulnerable. Oligarchy felt oppressive and narrow. Tyranny felt dangerous and unpredictable. Each form of rule carried memories of betrayal and bloodshed. Politics became less about ideals and more about preventing the worst possible outcome. Fear replaced ambition as the primary motivating force. The language Greeks used to describe themselves shifted subtly but permanently. Where once they had spoken of honor, of excellence, and of civic pride, they now spoke of safety, of balance, and of restraint. The heroic ideal that had shaped earlier generations, the willingness to risk everything for glory, began to feel reckless rather than noble. Parents no longer dreamed of sons dying gloriously in battle. They dreamed of sons surviving to old age. This was not moral decline in any simple sense, it was fatigue. Sparta, victorious in the conflict, yet drained by its demands, discovered that winning a war did not grant wisdom. Its rigid system, effective against enemies, proved incapable of managing empire or maintaining long-term stability. Control slipped. Revolts followed, authority weakened. The city that had defeated Athens lacked the flexibility to replace it as a center of power. Greece had no center anymore. Athens, though defeated militarily, remained intellectually alive. It no longer commanded fleets, but it still commanded attention. Students came to learn rhetoric, philosophy, and systematic thought. The city transformed from a ruler into a teacher. Its streets echoed not with political certainty but with questions. Plato would soon turn the trauma of the war into a search for perfect order. Aristotle would later examine constitutions not as ideals to be pursued, but as systems shaped by human weakness and practical constraints. Greek thought grew deeper because Greek confidence had been broken. Yet this intellectual flowering could not repair the structural damage that had been inflicted. The Greek world remained divided into small, fiercely independent communities, each jealous of autonomy, each fearful of domination, each unwilling to surrender authority, even when unity was clearly necessary. The war had proven the danger of rivalry, but it had not erased the impulse toward it. Instead, it had normalized it as an expected condition. Meanwhile, beyond the traditional Greek heartland, changes were unfolding quietly. To the north, Macedonia observed Greece carefully. Its leaders learned from Greek mistakes. They studied Greek warfare, politics, and culture, but they also saw what Greeks themselves could no longer see clearly, that endless independence without coordination led only to exhaustion. Macedonia did not fear Greek ideas, it planned to organize them. What the Peloponnesian War truly ended was not Athenian dominance or Spartan ambition alone, but the age in which Greek city-states could shape their destiny independently. The war had consumed the resources, the trust, and the unity required for self-determination. When the next power rose, Greece would resist, but without conviction. History had shifted direction. The Greeks had once asked how humans should live together. They had experimented with answers through democracy, through discipline, through empire, and through philosophy. The Peloponnesian War was the moment they learned that no system, however brilliant, could survive without restraint, humility, and awareness of limits. This lesson would not save them from what followed, but it would define their legacy. The fighting had ended, the consequences had not, and in the silence that followed, a new age was already approaching. Not loudly, not violently, but with the steady certainty of something that no longer needed to ask permission. Long after the final treaties were signed and the last prisoners returned to their homes, the Greeks slowly came to understand that the war had taken something from them that no peace agreement could restore. It was not territory, nor wealth, nor even power in the conventional sense. It was certainty. The quiet belief that the world, though harsh, ultimately made sense had dissolved somewhere between sieges, betrayals, and years of exhaustion. Before the Peloponnesian War, Greeks had argued endlessly, but they had argued within a shared assumption that their civilization stood at the center of human possibility. After the war, that assumption no longer felt solid. The cities still existed, the temples still stood, the gods were still honored, yet something invisible had shifted. The future no longer appeared as an extension of the past. It appeared unstable, unpredictable, and frighteningly open. Memory itself began to change. Stories of earlier victories, once told with pride, now carried bitterness. Marathon and Salamis no longer sounded like foundations of eternal greatness, but like distant miracles that could not be repeated. The heroes of the past felt unreal compared to the compromises of the present. Glory belonged to another time, another version of humanity that seemed unreachable. This shift altered how Greeks understood education, tradition, and authority. Elders no longer spoke with unquestioned confidence. Experience had failed to prevent disaster. Wisdom, once associated with age and status, was now treated with suspicion. Young men listened politely, but they trusted no one completely. The war had taught them that respected leaders could be wrong, persuasive voices could mislead, and collective decisions could destroy entire generations. Art reflected this loss of innocence. Tragedy no longer warned against pride alone, it mourned inevitability. Characters struggled not against fate, but against history itself. Trapped in cycles they could neither escape nor understand. Comedy grew sharper, darker, more bitter as laughter became a defense rather than celebration. Even beauty felt fragile, as if every achievement carried the awareness that it could vanish without warning. Philosophy, too, changed its tone. Where earlier thinkers had sought harmony between human reason and cosmic order, later thinkers became more cautious, more analytical, more detached. They asked not how the world should be, but how it actually behaved. When ideals failed, ethics became a problem rather than a promise. Politics became something to study, not something to believe in. Across Greece, independence lost its romantic appeal. Autonomy had once been the highest value, worth any sacrifice. Now it appeared dangerous, even irresponsible. Small states acting alone had nearly destroyed the civilization they shared. Yet unity felt equally threatening, associated with domination and loss of identity. Greeks were caught between two fears, the fear of submission and the fear of chaos. This paralysis defined the post-war world. Even the gods seemed more distant. Rituals continued, sacrifices were offered, festivals observed, but faith carried a quieter tone. Divine favor was no longer assumed. The war had shown that piety did not guarantee protection, that sanctuaries could burn, that prayers could go unanswered. Religion became more personal, less triumphant, woven into daily endurance rather than collective destiny. Most profound of all was the change in how Greeks viewed time. Earlier generations had imagined progress, that wisdom accumulated, that cities learned, that excellence could be refined and preserved. After the war, history felt cyclical and cruel. Achievements rose only to fall. Systems flourished only to decay. Permanence appeared to be an illusion invented by hope. This realization did not destroy Greek culture. It matured it, but maturity came with loss. By the end of the 5th century before the Common Era, Greece was still admired, still influential, still intellectually alive, yet no longer confident in its own future. The age of bold experimentation had closed. What remained was analysis, reflection, and quiet preparation for forces that Greeks themselves would not fully control. The Peloponnesian War did not simply end a conflict between Athens and Sparta. It ended the belief that Greek civilization could guide itself indefinitely through debate, tradition, and shared values alone. Power would soon belong to those who could impose order where persuasion had failed. And somewhere beyond the familiar cities, beyond the worn-out rivalries, a new kind of leadership was already forming. Patient, centralized, disciplined, and watching. The war was over. The age it belonged to was over as well. What came next would not ask whether Greece was ready. It would arrive regardless. When the Greek city-states emerged from the long exhaustion of the Peloponnesian War, they believed they were entering a period of recovery. The fighting had ended, the walls still stood, the assemblies still met, and the old rituals continued, as if continuity alone could restore what had been lost. But history had already moved past the assumptions that had sustained the classical world. Greece was alive, but it was no longer steering itself. The cities were tired, not simply weakened, but inwardly depleted. Decades of rivalry had hollowed out trust. Alliances were temporary, promises were fragile. Every polis watched its neighbors not with curiosity or admiration, but with suspicion shaped by memory. Each remembered betrayal. Each remembered loss. Each believed that vigilance mattered more than cooperation. This condition did not look like collapse. It looked like survival, and that made it dangerous. To the north of the Greek world lay Macedonia, a land the southern Greeks had never fully taken seriously. Macedonians spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, admired Greek culture, yet Athenians and Spartans alike dismissed them as semi-barbaric, rustic, unsophisticated. Macedonia was mountainous, scattered, and politically unstable. For generations, it had been more a borderland than a power, but borderlands learn lessons empires forget. While Greek cities argued endlessly about autonomy and tradition, Macedonia watched. While Athens reflected on its mistakes and Sparta struggled to maintain control, Macedonia adapted. It absorbed Greek culture without inheriting Greek paralysis. It learned from Greek warfare without repeating Greek rivalries. And then, in the middle of the 4th century before the Common Era, Macedonia found its architect. Philip II did not inherit a strong kingdom. He inherited vulnerability. Surrounded by hostile tribes, threatened by internal division, and overshadowed by wealthier southern neighbors, Macedonia was constantly at risk of collapse. Philip understood that survival required transformation, not gradual reform but structural change. He reorganized the army from the ground up. The traditional hoplite phalanx, once the symbol of Greek military excellence, had proven rigid and limited. Philip extended the spear into the sarissa, a weapon so long it demanded coordination rather than individual heroism. Soldiers became parts of a single organism. Discipline mattered more than courage. Training mattered more than lineage. This army did not debate, it advanced. Philip also understood politics as warfare by other means. He married strategically, negotiated relentlessly, bribed when useful, threatened when necessary, and struck only when conditions favored him. Where Greek leaders saw compromise as weakness, Philip saw it as timing. Where Greek assemblies delayed decisions through argument, Philip acted. The Greek world, fragmented and exhausted, could not respond effectively. City by city, Philip extended Macedonian influence, sometimes as an ally, sometimes as a mediator, sometimes as a protector, rarely at first as a conqueror. He did not announce the end of Greek independence, he simply made it increasingly irrelevant. Athens spoke passionately of freedom, but no longer possessed the strength to defend it. Sparta, rigid and inward-looking, lacked the flexibility to lead. The old centers of power argued about principles, while Philip built facts. The decisive moment came at Chaeronea in 338, before the Common Era. At Chaeronea, the illusion finally shattered. Greek forces, including Athenians and Thebans, assembled to stop Macedonian expansion. They fought not as rivals, but as defenders of a world that felt itself slipping away. Across the field stood Philip's army, disciplined, unified, and led by a young cavalry commander who would soon change history forever. His name was Alexander. The battle was brief and devastating. The sacred band of Thebes was annihilated. The Greek line broke. The old military traditions collapsed under the weight of something new. When the fighting ended, it was clear that resistance had failed, not because Greeks lacked courage, but because their system no longer matched reality. Greece was defeated not by outsiders, but by evolution. Philip did not destroy the cities. He did not burn Athens or dismantle its institutions. He understood symbolism. Greece was too valuable culturally to crush. Instead, he reorganized it under Macedonian leadership. The League of Corinth was formed, promising unity, peace among Greeks, and a new war, this time against Persia. On paper, Greece remained free. In practice, it was subordinate. Autonomy survived as ceremony. Power moved north. Before Philip could lead this new campaign, fate intervened. He was assassinated in 336 before the Common Era, struck down not by foreign enemies, but by the instability that always shadows centralized power. The kingdom passed to his son, a young man barely 20 years old, already shaped by war, ambition, and an education unlike any other. Alexander had studied under Aristotle. He knew Homer by heart. He admired Achilles and dreamed not of ruling but of surpassing every measure of greatness the Greek world had ever imagined. The Greeks watched him with doubt. They would soon follow him with awe. Alexander inherited not just an army, but a moment. Greece could not turn back. Resistance flared briefly, but was crushed decisively. The message was clear. Hesitation would no longer be tolerated. Where Philip had persuaded, Alexander commanded. And then he turned east, not as a Greek king, not as a Macedonian warlord, but as the carrier of a transformed world. The age of the polis had ended quietly, not with destruction, but with absorption. The debates of Athens, the discipline of Sparta, the tragedies, philosophies, and contradictions of classical Greece had not failed. They had simply reached the limits of what fragmentation could sustain. What followed would be larger, faster, and far more dangerous. History had found a new engine. After Cheronea, Greece did not erupt in rebellion, it hesitated. The shock of defeat did not produce immediate resistance because it did not feel like occupation in the familiar sense. The cities still governed themselves, the assemblies still gathered, and the old institutions continued to function. Yet something essential had changed, and everyone felt it, even if few could describe it clearly. Decisions were no longer final. They required approval, acknowledgement, or at least tolerance from a power that stood above the traditional Greek world. This subtlety was what made the transformation so effective. Athens struggled most deeply with the psychological consequences. For centuries, it had defined itself through speech, persuasion, and moral authority. Now, eloquence mattered less than alignment. Orators still spoke passionately about freedom, but their words no longer carried the weight of action. The city that once believed debate could shape reality was forced to confront a painful truth. Power had shifted beyond persuasion. Some Athenians accepted this pragmatically. They argued that survival required adaptation, not nostalgia. Others resisted intellectually, preserving the language of autonomy even as its substance faded. Freedom became a memory, rehearsed through speeches and plays, rather than a lived political force. Sparta responded differently. Its society had always prioritized discipline and control over debate. In theory, it should have adapted easily to Macedonian dominance. Yet Sparta's pride had been built on the belief that no one commanded it. Submission, even indirect, violated its identity. Isolated and increasingly irrelevant, Sparta chose defiance without strategy. Its resistance was brief and unsuccessful, serving more as a statement than a solution. The city that once terrified Greece had become a symbol of stubborn irrelevance. Across the Greek world, a quiet recalibration occurred. City-states stopped imagining themselves as independent actors, shaping the future, and began to see themselves as participants within a larger structure. Politics became less creative and more cautious. Leaders focused on stability rather than greatness. The ambition that had once fueled experimentation gave way to calculation. This was not immediate decay, it was controlled contraction. Philosophers sensed the shift before politicians could articulate it. The questions changed. Instead of asking how to design the perfect city, thinkers began asking how individuals should live within systems they could not control. Ethics moved inward. Responsibility became personal rather than collective. Happiness was redefined not as civic achievement, but as internal balance. The seeds of Stoicism and Epicureanism were already forming in this soil. Education adjusted as well. Rhetoric remained important, but it was no longer assumed that speech could transform political reality. Military training, administration, and loyalty gained prominence. Young men grew up admiring not citizen soldiers but professional commanders. Authority was no longer dispersed. It was concentrated. The polis, once the core of Greek identity, began to feel small. Despite this, Greek culture did not vanish. On the contrary, it spread. Macedonian rulers admired Greek art, language, and philosophy, adopting them as symbols of legitimacy. Greek teachers educated Macedonian elites. Greek architects designed Macedonian cities. Hellenism expanded even as Greek autonomy contracted. This paradox defined the age. Greece lost power but gained reach. The League of Corinth promised unity, peace among Greeks, and collective purpose under Macedonian leadership. In reality, it formalized a hierarchy. The cities accepted it not because they believed in it, but because alternatives were worse. Resistance meant destruction. Compliance meant survival. For the first time in centuries, Greece experienced order without choice. This new stability was unsettling. It removed the constant friction that had once driven creativity and competition, yet it also removed the destructive cycles that had nearly consumed the civilization. Greeks lived more safely but less intensely. The drama of independence gave way to the monotony of administration. Some welcomed this, others mourned it. As Alexander prepared to march east, Greece watched from a distance, no longer deciding but observing. The cities that had once shaped history now found themselves spectators to events far larger than themselves. Their ideas would travel further than their armies ever had, carried by Macedonian power into lands they could never have reached alone. The Greek world was no longer the stage, it had become the script. Alexander was born into a world already preparing to change, though no one yet understood how violently that change would unfold. He grew up in the shadow of a father who had broken the old Greek balance of power and replaced it with something colder, more disciplined, and infinitely more ambitious. Philip of Macedon had united Greece through force and diplomacy, but Alexander would inherit something far more dangerous than an army or a throne. He inherited momentum. From an early age, Alexander learned that limits were stories people told themselves when they lacked courage. Aristotle taught him philosophy, ethics, and poetry. But what truly shaped him was Homer. Achilles was not merely a hero to Alexander, he was a template. Glory was not an abstract concept, it was a duty. When Philip was assassinated, Greece watched carefully, almost hopefully, believing that the fragile unity might collapse. Alexander was young, too young, some said, to hold together what his father had built. Cities whispered about rebellion, old ambitions stirred. The idea that Macedonia's grip might loosen was intoxicating. Alexander responded not with negotiation, but with speed. The destruction of Thebes was not a military necessity. It was a message. A city erased not because it was unbeatable, but because it had dared to imagine independence. When Alexander ordered its annihilation, Greece understood something essential. This was not Philip's rule continued. This was something sharper, faster, and far less forgiving. Silence followed. With Greece subdued, Alexander turned east, carrying with him the official justification of revenge against Persia. But beneath the rhetoric lay a deeper impulse. Persia was not merely an enemy. It was the last remaining boundary. To conquer it was to prove that the Greek world was no longer confined to the Aegean, to the polis, or to the familiar. Crossing into Asia was a symbolic act. It marked the moment when Greek history stopped being regional and became global. At Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, Alexander did not simply defeat Persian armies, he dismantled an entire imperial psychology. Darius III commanded vast numbers, ancient prestige, and immense wealth. Alexander commanded belief. His soldiers followed him not because they were ordered to, but because they were convinced they were part of something unprecedented. Victory followed victory, and with each one the meaning of being Greek began to dissolve. Cities fell, not always through destruction, but through astonishment. Greek language spread not as conquest, but as administration. Greek architecture rose in foreign soil. Greek ideas traveled faster than Greek soldiers. Yet, something subtle occurred alongside this expansion. Greece itself stopped being the center. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, these names mattered less than Alexandria. Alexander founded cities not as colonies, but as anchors. Each Alexandria was a declaration that the old Greek world was insufficient. Civilization would no longer radiate outward from the polis. It would be engineered, planted, and governed. Culture became portable. This was not the fulfillment of Greek ideals, it was their transformation. As Alexander pushed further east, his army changed. Macedonians marched alongside Persians. Greek officers wore Eastern dress. Customs blended. Resistance came not only from conquered peoples, but from Alexander's own men who felt the ground of identity slipping beneath their feet. Alexander did not listen. In his mind, division was weakness. The old Greek obsession with separation, city against city, Greek against barbarian, was obsolete. He envisioned a unified world under a single authority, bound not by shared origin, but by loyalty to him. This vision terrified as much as it inspired. When Alexander reached India, geography itself seemed to rebel. The world did not end, but it refused to become familiar. His soldiers, exhausted and disoriented, finally refused to follow him further. For the first time, Alexander encountered a boundary he could not break with force. Reluctantly, he turned back. His return was not triumphant, it was haunted. He had outgrown the world he conquered and found no place to rest within it. Power isolated him, friends became threats, authority became paranoia. The man who had shattered empires now struggled to rule himself. When Alexander died in Babylon, the silence that followed was heavier than any battle loss. There was no successor strong enough to inherit his vision. His empire fractured almost immediately, divided among generals who possessed ambition but not transcendence. The unity Alexander imagined dissolved into competing kingdoms. Yet the transformation he initiated could not be undone. The Greek world was over, not destroyed, absorbed. In its place rose the Hellenistic age, a world where Greek language, philosophy, and art thrived without Greek political freedom. Identity shifted from citizen to subject, from participant to observer. Individuals sought meaning not through the city, but through personal ethics, inner peace, and universal reason. The questions of Socrates gave way to the answers of Stoics and Epicureans. Rome would inherit this world, admire it, and ultimately dominate it. But Rome did not create the global imagination. Alexander did. He was not the last Greek. He was the moment Greece ceased to belong only to Greeks. After Alexander's death, the world did not collapse into chaos. It reorganized itself slowly, unevenly, as if reality itself needed time to understand what had just happened. Empires rose where city-states once stood at the center of human imagination. Distances expanded, horizons widened, and with this expansion came a quiet but irreversible transformation of the Greek mind. The polis, once the universe in miniature, could no longer contain the weight of existence. For centuries, a Greek had known who they were by where they belonged. Citizenship defined identity. Participation in public life was not optional, it was existence itself. To speak in the assembly, to fight for one's city, to obey its laws, this was the rhythm of meaning. But in the Hellenistic world, this rhythm broke apart. Now the individual lived inside structures too vast to influence. The kingdoms that emerged after Alexander were powerful, centralized, and distant. Decisions were made in royal courts far removed from local concerns. Kings ruled not through debate but through authority. Law became administrative. Politics became professional. The ordinary person became small, and in that smallness a question emerged that had never mattered before. How should one live when the world cannot be changed? Philosophy responded first, not with blueprints for perfect states, but with guidance for surviving reality. Stoicism taught that freedom was not political, but internal. If fate governed the external world, then wisdom required acceptance. Emotions became liabilities, desire became a threat, The ideal life was one of the discipline, reason, and emotional restraint. The Stoic did not seek to escape the world, but to become unbreakable within it. This was not optimism. It was armor. Epicureanism offered a different refuge. If power corrupted and ambition destroyed peace, then the answer was withdrawal. Happiness was found not in public life, but in friendship, simplicity, and measured pleasure. Fear, especially fear of death, was the enemy. Remove fear, and life became bearable. This was not indulgence. It was survival through gentleness. Both philosophies shared a silent agreement. The age of shaping history had ended for the individual. Meaning had moved inward. Science flourished in this environment, freed from the political urgency of the old city-states. Alexandria became a beacon of knowledge, not because it was democratic, but because it was stable and wealthy. Scholars measured the earth, mapped the stars, dissected the human body, and calculated distances no Greek had ever imagined crossing. Knowledge expanded even as agency contracted. Art changed as well. Classical restraint gave way to emotional intensity. Sculptures no longer depicted idealized calm, but strain, movement, suffering, and passion. Faces twisted with pain or ecstasy. Bodies aged. Heroes became human. The world no longer believed in perfection, it believed in experience. Religion adapted. The old gods remained, but they felt distant, ceremonial, inherited. Mystery cults spread, offering personal salvation rather than civic ritual. People no longer sought divine favor for their city, but comfort for their souls. Faith became private. Language itself shifted. Greek became a universal tool, not a cultural boundary. It was spoken by people who were not Greek, thought by minds shaped by different traditions, and used to govern lands far from its birthplace. Hellenism was no longer ethnicity, it was infrastructure. This universality diluted its origin. The individual, once defined by collective purpose, now stood alone before an immense world. Some embraced this freedom, others felt lost within it. Anxiety became a feature of existence. Philosophy became therapy, wisdom became personal. The question was no longer what should we build together, but how can I endure? Yet this was not decline, it was adaptation. The Hellenistic mind was flexible, curious, resilient. It absorbed foreign ideas, blended traditions, and survived under new masters. When Rome arrived, it did not destroy this world. It inherited it. Rome ruled bodies, Greek thought ruled minds. Alexander's true legacy was not territory, nor cities, nor armies. It was scale. He made the world too large for old certainties, and in doing so, forced humanity to search for meaning beyond borders, beyond citizenship, beyond the familiar. The Greek world did not end in flames, it ended in expansion. After Alexander, history slowed its pace, as if unsure how to continue without the force that had driven it forward. The men who divided his empire did not inherit his vision. They inherited its fragments. Kingdoms emerged not as continuations of unity, but as compromises with reality. The Seleucids ruled vast eastern lands, the Ptolemies governed Egypt, the Antigonids held Macedonia, and between them lay a world that was Greek in language, but no longer Greek in spirit. Power had shifted from participation to administration. The city-states still existed. Their streets were walked, their temples maintained, their festivals celebrated. But their voices no longer shaped the future. Decisions arrived from afar, carried by officials rather than debated in assemblies. The old rituals continued, but they felt ceremonial, like reenactments of a past that no longer returned their calls. Greece had become historical while still alive. Athens remained a center of learning, not because it ruled, but because it remembered. Students came to study philosophy, rhetoric, and history, not to prepare for leadership, but to refine thought. The city that once trained citizens to govern now trained minds to reflect. Its greatness survived as legacy rather than authority. Sparta faded more quietly. Its system, once terrifyingly effective, proved too rigid for a world that demanded flexibility. Without relevance, it dissolved into symbolism, referenced more often than experienced. The Hellenistic kingdoms, for all their power, were fragile. Court politics replaced civic loyalty, assassinations replaced debate, armies grew larger, but trust grew thinner. Stability depended on individual rulers rather than shared institutions. Empires expanded, then fractured, repeating a cycle that felt impressive but hollow. Beneath this instability, a new force gathered strength. Rome did not arrive as a conqueror at first. It arrived as an observer, a student, an imitator. Roman elites admired Greek art, philosophy, and education, importing them eagerly. Greek tutors shaped Roman minds. Greek gods were adopted, renamed, and integrated. Culture flowed east to west, even as power prepared to flow west to east. Rome learned before it ruled. When Rome finally intervened in Greek affairs, it did so under the language of protection and order. Wars were framed as assistance, alliances as security. Cities welcomed Roman involvement, believing it temporary, manageable, useful. They had learned to live under distant authority before. They underestimated permanence. One by one, the Hellenistic kingdoms fell not through cultural failure, but through political exhaustion. Rome did not dismantle Greek civilization. It absorbed it methodically, reducing kings to governors and cities to administrative units. Autonomy vanished without drama. There was no final battle for Greece. There was only incorporation. By the time Greece became a Roman province, its transformation was complete. Greek thought dominated Roman education. Greek remained the language of philosophy and science. Greek identity survived, but as something detached from sovereignty. The Greeks had lost the world they created, but they shaped the world that replaced it. The tragedy of Greece was not conquest but success. Its ideas were too powerful to remain local. Democracy, philosophy, drama, and rational inquiry outgrew the cities that gave them birth. Once released, they belonged to history rather than to a people. Rome ruled the land, Greece ruled the mind. When the last free echoes of the polis faded, there was no mourning crowd, no fallen banner. Life continued. Markets opened, children learned Homer, philosophers debated virtue. The world went on. But the age of the city as the center of existence had ended forever. Greece did not fall in a single moment. It dissolved into continuity. When the story ends, it does not vanish. It lingers. Long after the last assembly fell silent, long after the final hoplite laid down his shield, long after the names of cities lost their power to decide the future, something remained, quiet and persistent, like an echo that refused to fade. This was not history anymore. It was inheritance. A man walks through a city that once believed itself eternal. He does not know the names of the streets, but he follows them anyway. Stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps guide him forward. Above him, columns rise, not to command, but to remember. He does not belong to this place, yet somehow it belongs to him. This is how Greece survives. Once, people believed the world could be understood by standing together in the open air, speaking freely, arguing fiercely, and deciding collectively what justice should mean. They believed that truth emerged from dialogue, that beauty could discipline the soul, and that reason was strong enough to hold chaos at bay. They were wrong, and they were right. They were wrong because power outgrew the city. They were right because thought outlived power. Empires rose, borders shifted, flags changed, but the questions remained. What is a good life? What do we owe each other? How should one live in a world that cannot be controlled? These questions did not die in Greece. They learned to travel. A student in Rome reads Aristotle without knowing the weight of the soil it came from. A philosopher in Alexandria debates ethics under a foreign crown. A child learns geometry not as Greek knowledge, but as knowledge itself. This is the final transformation, culture without ownership. The Greek world did not end in flames. Nor did it fade into silence. It dissolved into continuity, threading itself through centuries, languages, and minds. It became invisible, not because it vanished, but because it succeeded. Victory does not always look like survival. Sometimes it looks like disappearance. When history textbooks close, when the story finally stops speaking, the echo remains. It shapes how we argue, how we reason, how we imagine freedom, even when we no longer remember where those ideas were born. This is not nostalgia, it is presence. The ancient Greeks once believed that memory was a form of immortality. If that was true, then they never truly died. They live wherever questions are asked without fear, wherever reason challenges authority, wherever beauty is pursued for its own sake. They live in the pause after the story ends,